Welcome on to the next edition of the Faster Beyond 50 podcast. My name is Brad Nadauld. We've got the coach Lindsey Parry with us once again. And today we are doing a deep dive into the individualization of your training, particularly as an over 50s runner, and why it is so important not to do a one size fits all. There are three major levers that you can pull when it comes to individualization, and we're going to be jumping into each of those, and that is consistency, structure, and individualization. Geez, that's a tongue twister in itself. We're going to be talking about all three of those and how you can apply them in your training to make sure that you get the biggest bang for your buck. If you're going to do the work, you definitely want to get the results. Lindsey, nice to catch up. It's a week and a bit post my last marathon. Gee, I must tell you, I'm feeling a lot better than I did last week, Monday. How are things going on your side?
Brilliant, Brad. As you know, my goal is a long way off. So I'm still in the phase of just dialing in on that consistency. And it's been great so far. Really loving running. And I think one of the biggest things for me has obviously been the strength training that I'm working extremely hard on, and just the nature of not having the pressure to train a lot, but doing it consistently. Yeah, I'm running a lot better than I have for a long, long time. And that bodes well because my goal is only in the second half of the year. So far, so good.
Sounds amazing. Lindsey, let's dive straight into things. And before we get into that first lever that we can pull when it comes to individualizing our training as an over 50s athlete, let's talk about why individualization, particularly for over 50s, and why and how it differs from a one size fits all sort of approach.
Yeah, Brandon, I think the first thing that we need to take into account there is that as individuals, we all live a very different life or lifestyle, and that will be impacted by things like kids, grandkids, work situation. Do you travel? Don't you travel? So there's a lot of things that just happen around you locally that will actually determine how, when, and what sort of training you can do. And so the first kind of level of individualization for someone like you and me, that running isn't our job, it's our hobby, even if we are quite serious about it, is that there's a lot of individualization that has to go into making our lives work. And then, of course, the second tier of that individualization comes in around our own particular strengths and weaknesses. And those could be, but are not limited to kind of genetic strengths and weaknesses. So you may well be someone who's just always been naturally better at the shorter distances. And no matter how much training you do, you always perform relatively better over the shorter distances than the long. Perhaps it's the other way around. And then some of them are just actually from how we've gone about our running over the last 20 to 30 years. And those will be weaknesses that are ingrained because we have neglected to run our easy runs easy enough to do the aerobic work that's required, and or done too much or too little higher intensity work. And then, of course, not everybody ages at the same rate. So when we now move into the over 50, there's a strong bit of individualization that will come around. How long have you been training incorrectly? How long have you done no strength training? Did you do lots of strength training when you were a younger athlete? Now that you're starting to battle a little bit as you're getting older, is strength training one of the key elements missing? Have you been neglecting a specific type of training? Have you been running every day? Like, what does your structure look like? And so, yeah, so there's a lot of things that come in terms of individualization due to genetics, like also just because how we have done things for years and years and years.
Lindsey, I'm going to ask this question because we often, when we talk about things like this and you talk about how have you been training for the last 20, 30 years, one of the most common questions we get, particularly on our YouTube videos, is what if you've only taken up running in your 50s? So you don't have that previous track record to sort of look at.
Absolutely. And then it becomes just so important to train for where you are now. And there will be some steps that we put in place that are hopefully different to what we would do if we had someone, say, in their 20s that's never run before and wants to take up running. We will respond to the stimulus of training slightly differently. We will take longer to get to the point that we want to get to. And for the most part, and again, this is where individualization comes in, because for the most part, we're probably also dealing with people that have neglected all aspects of their health. And so the approach needs to incorporate getting the individual healthier, getting them doing strength training, and getting them to start slowly enough that we reduce the risk of them getting injured. Um, which would be different to somebody who's coming from like a hardcore strength training background, but now wants to add a cardiovascular element, and running is what they want to do. So again, that'll then take a slightly different approach for that individual than someone who's coming off the couch to start running.
Lindsey, before we get into some of the common mistakes that you see athletes over 50 making when they follow sort of generic training plans, if you'd like, let's just touch on and I think this relates to what we do here at coachparry.com, is almost the level of individualization. So, for example, you can go online and find yourself a generic training plan. There's thousands of them out there that don't take anything into account. They don't take your age. They don't take your experience levels, that sort of stuff. You just follow that plan. And then the opposite end of that extreme is one-on-one coaching, where you're working one-on-one with a coach. They take everything into account. They're adjusting things on the fly as you go. And we've got a couple of different offerings with ours where we've got the one-on-one coaching, and if anybody wants to access that, they're more than welcome to check it out on our website. I'll put the links in the description below as well. But with the vast majority of the athletes that train with us use our training plans, they are training plans and they're individualized in the sense that we work out training paces for each individual athlete, and that then is very individual, very specific to that individual. So no two training plans are going to be alike on our training platform, even on, if you'd like to put it, the more generic of the training plans we've got within Fast to Beyond 50.
Absolutely. And so that individualization will happen on two scales. And the first one is that our platform is extremely flexible. So when you look at the plans on the face of it, they will look fairly generic, because they generally tend to have running on the same day, strength training on specific days, and then there's different levels or ability, if you like, that are baked into those plans. But what we've created in those is a high degree of flexibility. So one of the things that allows those Coach Parry plans to be so individualized is that we do believe in a very high focus on recovery and not overtraining. And so we limit the number of days that people run, okay? Not necessarily exercise, because we allow room for cross training and strength training. But because we limit the number of running days, that in itself creates its own flexibility to individualize your week around your life. And then, very importantly, Brad, as you've alluded to, is that one of the big things we are very big on at Coach Parry is training for where you are now. So regardless of what race or race distance you are training for, a marathon, a 5K, just getting off the couch and starting to move, you will be in a specific place right now. And based on that, we will help you to calculate a estimated threshold in pace and heart rate. And then those are the two levers that we would use to help you set the right intensities for your easy runs and for your interval work and the type of things that you've got to do. And that's why if 3 people come onto the platform and plug those values into the plan, they might be following a similar plan, but it'll be very different in terms of the actual execution, and it'll be pitched for the level that they are at. And that will bring out a very strong degree of individualization, which will bring about the optimal. And that's a very important word. It brings about the optimal improvement, because we could maximize your improvement, but then you're always on the risk of getting sick or injured. Whereas we greatly reduce that risk of being sick and injured by pulling you back, pegging your training for where you are now, and then improving slower, but much more sustainably.
Yeah, Lindsey, I'm gonna come back to that point now where you're talking about the optimal training, because just as you said that, it reminded me of something with the elites that you've worked with over the years up to Olympic level. You've been to 4 Olympic Games, and something that I've picked up, and maybe I'm way off, but I'm going to ask you that question when we get to lever one, because I think it's important. But let's just touch on some of the mistakes that you see over 50s runners making when they're following generic training plans.
So look, the number one, the biggest one, quite simply, is they go in and run their hard runs, their easy runs too hard. I've got hard stuck on the brain. But that's it. I mean, that is almost always the biggest mistake. The mindset when I'm dealing with athletes, particularly as they're approaching and just into their early 50s, is that their mindset is that in order to achieve similarly to what they did in the past, they have to work harder. And sometimes that even includes doing more. So they'll go out and seek generic plans that call for them to do more training load than they've been doing. And then in the execution of those plans, because they feel like they consistently have to feel like they are working hard, and they almost wear being tired of a badge, like a badge of honor. Because if they're tired all the time, it means that they're doing the work they need to do to hang on to where they were before. And unfortunately, it has the opposite impact. We have instances very often where we see athletes improve a lot in the short term by training the way they should be training. But because we're getting older, that improvement isn't really a sustainable improvement. In other words, by training, when you get into your 50s, 60s, 70s, when you train properly, you will improve in the short term. But it's not sustainable to go, okay, well, I'm just going to keep improving, because we just know that's not practically possible as we get older. However, if you don't train properly, that cliff is a steep cliff that ends in frustration and injury. You're not enjoying yourself. You're nowhere near where you used to be. You can't understand why you're slowing down so much. But if you do the right things and you do them all the time, you get into this period of your life where you can really maintain your performance levels for quite a long period of time, but only if you are lose traction really slowly, really slowly, really slowly. And look, my dad's just the easiest example to use here always, Brad, because I've been working with him for 25 years now. And to see what he is able to achieve at 75, he is still running 50 minutes for a 10K. And he's been running 50 minutes for a 10K for the last 6, 7 years. Like, we really are keeping him at that level, and he is losing so little. And it's because he's doing the right things at the right time, at the right intensity.
I love that. Lindsey, let's talk about, before we dive into that first lever that you can pull when it comes to individualization, let's talk about some of the key physiological sort of differences and recovery differences, because I think recovery is probably one of the big things that you see in runners over 50 to the general population, and how things change as we get older.
Yeah, so look, there's just no question that we in our 50s are in a degenerative period of our life. So in other words, we are losing muscle, we are losing bone mineral density, we are losing cardiovascular capacity, we are losing lung capacity. And it's true that we have a use it or lose it principle in play. So if we don't use it, we will lose that stuff even faster. But what that really means is that when you go out for a 20K run, 12 to 13 mile run, when you're in your 50s, the stress that your body feels is very different to what that 20K run was like when you were 35 or even 45, because you do have less muscle, weaker muscle. And so your body experiences that 20K very differently. So the first part is quite simply in the physical stress that we experience when we are in our 50s. Okay, so that does mean that 20K will be harder. It does mean that in relative terms, So in terms of the total number of muscle fiber available, the relative impact is that we have more damage from a percentage point of view than when we were 35 to 45. And what that then means is that after that 20K run, is that the recovery process is also compromised and takes longer. So it takes longer because there's more damage that needs to be repaired, but also because there is less raw material around and the physiology is coping slower. So I think the big thing in there is that we therefore need more recovery time. And I would say that's probably the single biggest mind shift that we need to make, is that when we are older, it takes longer to repair. And therefore, we need to find ways to train so that we can minimize both the damage and the impact of requiring that more time. So the harder you train, the more time you need to give yourself to recover.
Yeah, Lindsey, and that sort of ties into exactly what I wanted to ask you with regards to the first lever, which is consistency. And consistency, it's amazing. As I get older, I'm just realizing this more and more in all aspects of my life, that consistency is the number one thing that moves the lever everywhere. So whether it's investing for retirement, as an example, it's not about putting a big amount of money in and then never worrying about it. It's little bits over a prolonged period of time. It's the same thing with relationships. I always joke that if you're married and you only come home once every 2 weeks, your marriage is not going to last. Okay, and it's the same thing with your running. Consistency is just such a we almost paid lip service, but it is just like, it is so crucial. And I wanted to talk about the optimal side of things, where you were talking about that we're not optimizing for performance per se, we're optimizing for consistency. And I've seen it with some of the elite athletes that you've trained up to the Olympic level. And I watch with amazement how hard they push themselves, that they're on the limits like all the time, because they're trying to get so much out of their performance. And often it's easy to sort of teeter over to the other end and you pick up an injury. And the problem with doing that when you're in your 50s, 60s, and 70s is when you go over the edge, it takes so much longer to bounce back. And you can get away with it when you're in your 20s and 30s, but it just becomes harder and harder to do as you get older. Let's talk about sort of how you define consistency in training and why it's more important than intensity on its own in runners over 50.
If you're over 50 and want to recover from sessions faster, run pain and injury free, and improve your endurance, then be sure to join Lindsey and I for our upcoming Faster Beyond 50 Masterclass. In it, we'll show you how we helped a 70-year-old run a 47-minute, 18-second 10K, and how you can take those exact same principles and apply them in your training. Simply scan the QR code that's on screen right now, or click on the link in the description below to save your seat in the training now. We look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah. So, I mean, consistency is quite literally what we do day to day, week to week, and month to month. So that is really what defines that consistency. And I think you've really got two, let's call it two different types of intensity as it pertains to this group of 50, 60 plus year olds that we are talking about. And the first one is that we're not talking about consistency in terms of motivation and discipline, because there's one kind of band of 50, 60, 70-year-olds that are just consistent by their very nature. They have been doing this for decades, not not for a few weeks and a few months. So the consistency of habit is there. In this group of runners, the biggest threat to their consistency is not their motivation and their discipline. It is getting sick and getting injured. Okay. So in other words, training poorly leads them to a point that they cannot do what they love, because they're spending more and more time away from doing it because of illness and injury. And so they get into a downward spiral of performance and consistency. The other side of the coin, of course, is people that are starting out. And when you're starting out, consistency is driven by very different things in the short term. So motivation is that thing that gets you going. Okay. Discipline keeps you going. But ultimately, the only way to maintain that consistency and change it from the week to week, month to month, year to year is habit. And the thing that'll stop you from forming the habit in that tier is exactly the same thing that breaks your consistency when you get older. And that's having to continually restart because you keep breaking down with injury, because you are doing too much, too soon, too hard. Okay. And then in that group, I would also lump together people who do genuinely lose motivation because they get themselves into a cycle of diminishing performance, and it becomes difficult for them to get up. So you've got one lot that will push too hard, too often, trying to fight off age, and then you've got the other lot that actually just lose motivation and heart too quickly because they have been actually slightly overtraining for years, but getting away with it because of their age, and now that accelerates their loss in performance. So those are probably the three groups or subgroups, and how lack of consistency creeps into their run.
All right, let's talk about sort of the group that are constantly tired or sort of overtraining. What are some of the things and some of the things that they can do in order to counteract that, to make sure that they're not overdoing it so that they are able to stay consistent?
So, Brad, the first two things are actually quite simple. They're not necessarily easy to implement because it requires quite a mind shift. Okay. The first is actually to implement more rest into your structure. Okay, so that's physically giving yourself 1 to 2 days per week where you are allowing yourself to recover from the efforts of your training. And the second one is to actually start doing your training at the correct intensity for where you are right now. And for 95% of the people that we work with, that literally equates to slowing down. Now, there isn't a way of saying this. I've been trying to think up a better term to use than slowing down. I mean, because the focus should be on the intensity. The intensity needs to be easy, and so that should be our focus. But in the vast majority of people that we deal with, that does mean going slower, because you need to go easier than you're going. Most people are going too hard. But I hate the concept of then people associating this type of training with being slow. Okay. It's not about being slow. It's about getting the intensity right so that in the short term you can actually be faster. Okay. So those are the two kind of structural levers that we can pull immediately. Train at the right intensity and make sure that you give yourself enough rest in every week.
The next one is the mindset one, Lindsey, and this is quite a tough one to sort of get over. And what advice would you give to runners who are frustrated because they can't train as hard as they used to? Maybe they're not as fast as they used to. They feel like they're losing ground, and they just are done. They're like over this.
So I've given that a lot of thought, especially as I start approaching 50s. I've thought about this kind of mindset one, and part of it is that because we are in a funnel. Okay, we're in a funnel that has a natural selection. More and more people drop off because so many people don't do this right. And so, because so many people are not doing it right, there are people that constantly feel injured all the time, and that leaves them frustrated, unmotivated, and they stop running. There are people that are only results focused. So, even being competitive in their own age groups, it's not enough for what they've developed and why they've been running over the years. So the fact that they can never be their best. They'll never meet those best, means that those people fall out of the funnel. So one of the issues we sit with is that this funnel is thinning out the herd, so to speak. And so who have we got left to train with? Many of our peers have stopped. And so we move to training with younger people, and younger people give us energy. So it's not only a function of that's all there is to train with. Those younger people they give us energy. They love our experience, so they also love having us around to bounce ideas off us and talk to us about training, and they love hearing stories about how we did what. So there's good synergy in training with those younger people. However, we start to feel the pressure to keep up. And that's where I'm going with this, is that a lot of times there is more pressure to keep up with our younger training partners than there even is to perform well on race day. And I sit in one-on-one calls where a lot of people that book those calls don't want to talk about how to train for their next marathon. They just want to talk about how can I help them to get a little bit better again so that they can continue to enjoy training with those younger runners. But that is a double-edged sword, because in training with those younger runners, very often it means that our bread and butter aerobic work is just done too hard. In fact, it's probably not even aerobic anymore, it's anaerobic. So we're doing high amounts of damage, not giving ourselves time to recover from those efforts, and either extremely fatigued, sick, or injured.
And then, Lindsey, before we move on to the next lever, let's talk a little bit about the folks who feel like they need to be doing more. So often, and this, I don't quite know how to put this, like people want to train every day just because it's like from a mental health perspective. But as you said, I mean, running more as you get older is just doing more and more damage, leaves you less time to recover. We often prescribe for the vast majority of people to be running 4 days a week. But what if somebody does want to train every single day and they just feel like if they're taking days off, they're losing ground by taking those days off?
Yeah, so as we get older, there's absolutely room to do some non-impact forms of exercise, swimming, cycling, elliptico, that still allow you to work on that aerobic component, but they reduce the actual damage to your muscles. If you don't have any of those things available to you, and we are going to talk about strength training at some point in the podcast, but if you don't have the cross-training, non-impact things available to you, I promise you're going to run better by giving yourself that recovery time. So the running every day, 5 days a week is plenty. And if you are feeling like the pressure of not doing those days, you're going to gain more out of not training on those days than you are going to from training on those days. You always phrase it really, really well, Brad, and I don't know why I kind of butcher it, but literally the only training you can benefit from is the training that you allow yourself to recover from. And so if you're training 6 days a week, particularly running training 6 days a week, you're not allowing yourself to recover from that training, which means that you cannot benefit from that training.
Absolutely. Holy smokes, Lindsey, I just looked at the time. We've been going for close on half an hour already. So what I'm going to do, we're going to turn this into a part 2, because there's lots we still want to unpack, obviously, with the other 2 levers, which is all about training smarter and not harder, and then tailoring your training for maximum results, which is lever 3. I'm going to put a pause on this now, and we'll come back next week and finish off those 2 points, and then talk about some practical ways to implement this in your training. And that's cool. Lindsey, I think there's lots to unpack, and I think in order to do it justice, we really do need to go deep. So we're going to save that for next time. Thank you to everyone who has been listening. Also to everyone who's left us a review and a rating on whatever platform you listen on, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We really do appreciate it. And helps us get in front of other runners just like you as well. So we'll be back again next week with part 2 of this individualization deep dive, and how you can implement things in your training to make sure you keep running well into your 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. Until then, cheers.